صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
We are here with Sayyid Sulaiman Hassan, an esteemed scholar from the Ahlul Bayt Islamic Seminary and the Baytul Ilm Academy in Chicago. And today's topic of discussion is gender relations and modernity. And so, because we are short on time, I figured that we would go ahead and get started right away in the topic. And so Sayyid, inshallah, what we'll do is we'll start off with a few theoretical questions, and then inshallah quickly move to more practical related matters that everyday community members experience in their institutions and the American society largely broadly, So, say first of all, regarding the whole issue of male and female and gender as we know it, the Quran seems to speak of these pairings as something that is part of the creational scheme of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, something that has some sort of purpose and some sort of design and wisdom. And so my question is, why is this the case, and what is so special about this particular arrangement that could not have been accomplished with one gender? Why male, why female, and what purpose does it have?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين الهداة المهديين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And to get right into the question that you raised, and I encourage all of you who may have something that you'd like to add to the conversation, a comment or a question, and please do raise your hand, even if it's while myself or any of us are speaking, so that we know that you're waiting to be heard, inshallah. That way we'll try to keep our eyes open as well, and we'll be able to facilitate a better conversation. That's a very important question. Why did Allah create us in this way? And before we try to gain some insight into why creation is according to one particular set of rules or in one particular way, not another way, we do have to recognize that we're not approaching this from the top. We're not approaching this from a perspective where we can ever understand all of the details and all of the wisdom in Allah's creation. We're approaching it from the bottom. So we have a limited and inductive sort of a means of seeing some of the wisdoms, maybe learning some of the explanations that have been given by the Prophet or by the Imams, or the words of revelation from Allah Himself. But we're not going to try to get a comprehensive explanation, because that's not humanly possible for us. And that comes with a lot of questions that may be difficult for us to understand. When it comes to gender relations, we want to try to understand what might be some of the insights for why Islam has given us a certain set of teachings, so we can appreciate them better, we can develop motivation to apply them. But if we're coming at it with the perspective that we need to be able to justify in every scenario and in every possible condition why the Islamic system gives better results socially, materially, spiritually, economically, and in any other field than every possible alternative system, that's going to be a losing battle. There is a need for humility and for faith in filling in some of the gaps, or in trusting that there must be some wisdom, even if there is a gap in my understanding of it. But we do have a means of gaining some of the insight that we need to be able to appreciate the value in our religious teachings. And that insight comes from religious texts, and it comes from observing the nature of creation. And the broadest point that we can make is that in creation, Allah wants there to be dynamism. He wants there to be movement. He wants there to be momentum rather than inertia. So within creation, we find that even non-human living beings are progressing from one state to another, going from potentiality to actuality, and reaching a perfection that is defined for them. Humanity also is meant to go from a potential to an actual, from a state of imperfection to a state of perfection. That comes from being deprived economically and acquiring our needs, from being ignorant and acquiring knowledge, from not having control over our passions and our anger, for example, and developing control over our emotions, passions, anger, and so on. And one of the ways that Allah has created that dynamism and taken away our inertia is by creating male and female, and then creating an attraction and a complementary relationship between the two. It's part of not just human existence, it's part of not just male-female relationships, but it's part of creation as a whole. That there is a place that we find ourselves in, and Allah wants us to have a push through our intellect, through our emotion, through the faculties of our soul, towards another direction. That push allows us to develop various kinds of relationships with other people, and to develop a relationship with Allah through movement, growth, learning, and development.
Okay. And so coming to the question of this dichotomy, so sometimes what we see in books written by scholars from the Islamic perspective is that Allah has created males in one way and females in another way, and that particular type of creation implies ways of behavior, ways of being, modes of existence in society. And oftentimes in the West, you will find that this type of framing is criticized by just recourse to, for example, different setups in history, in pre-modern societies, in Western societies, in modern societies, that are often very different from what you would expect an Islamic society to look like. And they even point to certain examples in the animal kingdom, ants, bees, praying mantises, and things like that, which have a very different role to play than what you might expect, again, Muslim societies to place for the roles of men and the roles of women. But how do we engage with that difficulty? And are these formulations by scholars explicit in the teachings of the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt, or are they assessments after the fact that we're trying to understand the wisdom of Quranic prescriptions?
There certainly are some teachings that we find in the Quran and the Hadith that give a specific role to men, a specific role to women. And in some cases, those roles are different. In the majority of cases, when it comes to worship, when it comes to even our obligations to fellow human beings, they are either the same or very similar. Right? So there might be some minor details about prayer that are different for men and women, but by and large, the rules are the same. In the religious and in the social dimension both. But not all of those distinctions that we have within Islam, whether it be from the Quran, whether it be from a hadith, not all of them are natural distinctions. It might be a debate that a social scientist would have. Does this particular way that women generally process information or respond to various social or other factors, does that go back to something innate within their nature, or does it go to the way they are socialized and the way they are nurtured? And the only way to get a perfect answer really would be to do a controlled experiment, which would probably throw up many ethical questions. Other than that, you can only gain perhaps some hints by looking at anthropology, by looking at different human societies, by trying some experiments, okay? And perhaps by looking at the animal kingdom. But the saving grace from an Islamic perspective is that it doesn't really hinge on whether it is a nature or a nurture issue. We don't believe in Islam that there is a role for men and a role for women because women are naturally more emotional than men, or that men are naturally better at, say, spatial tasks than women are. What we believe in Islam is that there might be some natural differences, and perhaps our sciences will, constantly change in what things they consider to be natural versus based on nature. But then there might be many things that are not natural. And from an Islamic perspective, that's not a relevant distinction. The relevant distinction is what things does Allah intend to keep equal, and what things has Allah intended to keep separate. So to give an example, it's often believed by traditional cultures that women are perhaps more emotional than men, and men tend to be more rational than women. And if you look at a lot of traditional societies, then you may actually even find evidence for that to be the case. But would you be able to say that that's because women are naturally more emotional? Not necessarily. They might have been taught, they might have been spoken to, socialized, educated in a way that would lead to that result. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it might very well be possible to raise men in a particular society to be just as emotional as women tend to be raised. If you start to tell a young boy from the earliest age that his value is by how cute he is rather than by what he has accomplished. And it might be possible to raise women to be rational. Right? That's an interesting debate academically. It might have social repercussions, but the more important debate for us as a Muslim is not to specify that question, but to say, what role has Islam sought men and women to play? If there is a different role, there might not be, but if there is a different role, then if it's not natural, we need to socialize men and women to be different. It might not be natural. We need to artificially socialize them to accomplish that goal. Or it might be natural. So the focus is different. That's not to say that all of those things that traditional society believed were natural differences between men and women are natural differences. It's not to say that all of them are desirable differences. But the focus from an Islamic perspective is a little bit different. If I can just add one philosophical point that puts it a little bit into perspective. From a non-religious perspective, from a secular perspective, the individual is the starting point of our worldview, our ethics, and our belief system. The individual. And when the individual is the starting point, we would want to assume that individuals are as equal as possible. It is problematic for us to say that different races or ethnic groups, that different genders, that different individuals have a different nature. From an Islamic perspective, we believe that the individual has been created as a matter of divine mercy and grace in order to fit into its place within the cosmos. So that the human being, with our body and with our soul, is meant to find out what is our role, what is our purpose within our family, our society, our material environment, within all of God's creation. So the individual is not the be-all and end-all. The individual is meant to try to fulfill a role. And when we have roles to play within a very complex and a very intricate creation, it's not illogical for there to be differences in that role that would come from God. Again, it's not to say what those differences may or may not be. The Quran emphasizes the spiritual equality of all of humanity across different races and across different ethnicities and genders and language groups. But it does also state that for that cosmic role to be best represented, different individuals will need to play slightly different roles. Or to put it in a more spiritual framework that is often used within Islamic sciences, God has an infinite number of divine names of beauty and mercy, and different human beings will at different times of their lives represent and manifest different names of God or different attributes of God within creation. And that's something that, from that starting point, is not unexpected, or it's not problematic.
Saint Suleiman, can you elaborate on those different roles, those slightly different roles?
What are the different roles? So I think that one thing that we would say Islam has clearly emphasized within the legal teachings that we have, the rules of Sharia, is that a human being should strive not to fulfill a redundant role, but to fill a complementary role. It's a matter of principle, and how that complementarity will show itself in a particular relationship is the second question that we can talk about. But the initial principle is that if we have a marital relationship, the ideal marital relationship might not be for us to say that both partners are equally responsible for the economic well-being of the family, equally responsible for the spiritual well-being of the family, equally responsible for the children, equally responsible for every one of the spheres. And then every decision should be made on that basis of equality and on the basis of negotiation, or on the basis of splitting things down the middle. Right? In principle, and I'm not saying that now the husband actually gets all of the fun stuff and the wife gets all of the hard stuff, or the wife gets all of the housework and the husband gets all of the exterior work. That's a separate question that we can talk about. But as a matter of principle, Islam wants us to recognize that, for example, that marital unit is a single unit now. And when you have one unit, not two individuals, but one unit, it makes sense for there to be some complementariness in that relationship, some specialization, because they formed one unit. And the same thing applies with our other roles within society, in our interactions, even outside of gender relationships, but in our gender relationships. So that's the background for the difference. Now, what is that difference? We can see that at least in the time of the Prophet and in the time of the Imams, there was an emphasis that the primary role of a woman should not be seen in material or economic or political terms. And the primary role of a husband or a man should be seen in terms of responsibility for protection, responsibility for economic security, that responsibility. Does that mean that there are some men who may not be especially good at fulfilling a role that traditionally was assumed to be a woman's role? Not at all. There's nothing wrong with that. Does that mean that there might not be women who are especially driven to excel in a career and especially qualified to do so? Not at all. But that ideal was represented in, for example, the Islamic law that a husband is responsible for meeting the financial needs of the family, even if he might be poor. A woman is not responsible for that, even if she be wealthy. Now, obviously, a woman who is part of a family, if she can afford to, would want to ensure the financial well-being of the entire family. But that's then a moral decision, not a legal obligation that she has. So that's something that we find within Islamic teachings. The difficult part, though, is to see how we can apply those ideals today's circumstances, which are very changed, and that's an application question, and to see whether maybe some of those ideals themselves might not apply. Maybe the ideal itself represented an application for one society and not an ideal for today's society. That is a little bit of a challenging question. And none of what I've said until now is to presuppose a particular conclusion to those two questions. So I don't know if you want to open up to...
Sure, of course, as Sayyid had mentioned, you're most welcome to ask any questions. Anyone from the audience can raise their hand and we'll be happy to call on you. Yes, go ahead.
On gender relations, this may be a little diversion from the main topic, but you know, the negative impact of social engineering, which has given rise to the unfortunate acceptance of homosexuality in society, is indicative of recent Supreme Court rulings that say that homosexual marriage is as normal as the traditional marriage as we know between man and woman. So basically, this is a challenge for Muslims because not only that, the impact of that way of thinking is affecting our schools, our educational institutions, even as early as grade school, where children are being taught that homosexuality is a normal alternative lifestyle. So, as much as we would like to ignore the fact that many Muslims are being impacted by this, as you know, some Muslims are practicing homosexuals, at least they call themselves Muslims. That's the reality. My question is, what is Islam's position on homosexuality? Is it something that we are born, or is it a combination of being born that way as well as being taught to accept this? And I guess the second question is, what should be
why don't we start with that?
Okay.
And then, because otherwise it might get a little bit too big to handle.
All right.
And then the natural tendency that at least I would have is to give a very long answer and we'll be out of time.
Okay.
So we'll take that first question and then maybe we can continue the conversation. I think it is a little tangentially related, but it's part of gender relations. And so one thing that we want to be aware of is that, just as there are certain assumptions, like we said that in the West, we start from the individual, and so we make an assumption that men and women are equal. And if there is some evidence that, for example, women's and men's brains don't process information in the exact same way, or they might not biologically be suited to all of the same tasks, right? Then we naturally, culturally, will say, well, let's try to compensate for that, right? That a man should be able to dress however he wants, a woman should be able to dress however she wants. Forget the biology, forget psychology. That's a decision that's made not on the basis of observed fact, but prior to processing those observed facts. And if facts are inconvenient, then we'll try to find social policy or legal policy to compensate for it. You can think of many examples. The issue of homosexuality is the same way, right? That's an identity that exists within modern society. Islam did not ever view homosexuality. Islam did not ever view homosexuality in that kind of way that we often think of it in modern culture. It's difficult for us to almost remove ourselves from our modern secular culture, right, where homosexuality is viewed as something unique. But let me try to draw an image for you for how it would be viewed from within an Islamic context. The idea of attraction, right, or the human attraction to something that is attractive, that is arousing, was never viewed in Islam as being exclusive to heterosexual attraction. Right? And that is why Islam has said that there might be various forms of attraction, various forms of orientation, to call it, that a person will have, that are a continuum. The relevant question is that regardless of whether I happen to be very, if I have a strong sexual desire or a weak sexual desire, or whether I have a very strongly heterosexual or a bisexual or a homosexual orientation, in Islam we are told that when it comes to behavior, there is a right and a wrong way to utilize that passion. Just as there is a right and a wrong way to utilize anger. Just as there is a right and a wrong way to utilize the desire to get ahead economically. The question is not really, is the orientation natural or is it based in nurture? So much as it's what is supposed to be my response and my decision in terms of how I live my life. The difference will come, for example, that if a person is not attracted to someone of the same sex, then that is not a temptation that they would have. But that person might commit another sin. It might be a sin of, God forbid, adultery, or it might be a sin of perhaps gambling, or it might be a sin of not taking their prayers seriously, right? And another person who has a different set of temptations, they at one point in their life fall into the temptation or the sin of acting on a homosexual urge. Today, those would be two different identities. One would consider themselves to be a member of one community. Within the Islamic worldview, though, all of them would be regarded as fallible human beings who have a temptation, who have a particular struggle, which they need to work on, and they need to align their practice with the divine teachings that we have in our religion. And this is a much more healthy worldview, because it focuses on us as dynamic beings, not as static beings. The idea that, my family or my spouse should love me for who I am is a little bit of an unfortunate belief that many people have. Because who I am is largely a factor and a result of circumstances beyond my control. What makes me human and what makes me worthy of love, receiving and giving love, is not where I started out, but what I am doing with what I was given, the direction that I'm moving in. And the direction is what the Islamic worldview focuses on. So to answer in short, in Islam, human beings have choice. We have different temptations, and it's not just in terms of sexuality, it's in terms of any issue that we face. We have different temptations, but we do have choice. And it is those choices that define our moral state. And none of those temptations is an identity. Our identity is an identity.
So when you do say that the way you suggested is more healthy, is that because it kind of does not overemphasize the certain temptation or desire that someone has? And
yes, so for example, if I was raised a certain way, or maybe I was born a certain way, regardless, I had a propensity to criminality. I don't define my identity based on criminality. Now, some of us certainly have a personality that is, kind of straight and narrow. Some of us have a personality that is less risk averse, and we might have a greater propensity to push the envelope. Right? But that's not really a relevant formation part of my identity. What's relevant to my identity is what decisions I make, what moral course I chart for my life. It makes it easier for me to recognize different kinds of temptation as a healthy part of my movement towards God, rather than saying, well, this is where I started out, and therefore that's right. Because a lot of people, they say that, well, if I believe that homosexuality is wrong, that means that I'm questioning the wisdom of God's creation. Why would God create me in this way if He wanted me to live a different way? Right? But that could be said about anything within humanity. God created a lot of us not to want to go to school. It doesn't mean that going to school then is not being true to ourselves. We learn, we grow, we discipline, we harness our potential, and we muzzle certain temptations, either because of our intellect, or because of our religious teachings, or because of our fitrah telling us this is the best course of action. There's different degrees of perception we have, and if there is a passion that I have, or a propensity that I have, that my religion, or my belief system, or my intellect tells me is wrong, it's being true to myself to change that propensity. Because my intellect and my belief system is also part of who I am. Right? That always puts in the foreground the moral question. Whatever the moral belief system you choose might be. As a Muslim, my moral belief system tells me that consumption of mind-altering substances is forbidden. That certain types of risk-taking behavior, like gambling, are forbidden. Certain ways of fulfilling my sexual desire are forbidden. That's my belief system. And what makes me a moral person is how I respond to it, not what my static identity might be at one particular moment in my life. I'm not defined by that. And in the West, sexuality is seen as an identity, but many other things are not seen as an identity. That's a social choice. It's a social construct. It doesn't represent anything in reality. That's the difference between the civil rights movement and between sexuality. And the civil rights movement, or a civil rights movement, for example, for women, if their rights are being suppressed, or for a racial minority, that is something that is a given. That's not something.
You're saying that gender and race is something more real than the choice we make with our sexual identity, sexual orientation. It's something different fundamentally than the desires that I have?
Well, gender is something real. Right? Gender is something real within our existence, and when it comes to race, we can't say that race is something real. Race is also a social construct, and in some cases, we might want to question the definition of that social construct as well. Okay? So for example, in America, there's some very unusual rules about what constitutes a colored person historically. The one-drop rule, rules of miscegenation.